Generation F stands for Generation Faith. One of the things that I wanted to kind of have with this podcast is this parallel between, two major generations, right? You are Gen X, I believe, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, Gen X, and we
No,
have
yeah,
technically,
yeah. Boomer.
yeah,
I'm a
yeah.
boomer.
Oh,
I'm
you're
a
a
boomer.
boomer. Oh no. Uh-oh.
Uh huh.
All
Uh huh.
right, all right. That's okay. That's even better.
Sorry.
That's even better because then we have a large time gap from the millennials, the Gen Z, any of the other new generations coming up. And one of the things that I feel really led to do with this show, if you will, is to make sure that what we're saying is encouraging, because one of the things that I see a lot in the podcast world right now, whether it be non-denominational or Catholic or even just secular, is there's so much just fear-based information that's permeating the faith world. There's so much information coming out about the times that we live in and everything going on. Um, but I'm always led into the scripture to see that we're not supposed to live in fear.
No.
We're supposed to be bold and to bring peace. And a couple things that I want to kind of open up with is just to get the audience or the people listening a better understanding of who we are. And it doesn't have to be a lengthy conversation, but just kind of like a little synopsis or small testimony about kind of what led you to faith, and where you're at now, and how you kind of want to kind of be seen in this kind of immediate lens. If you want, I can go first, or you can go first. It's up to you.
You got it, dude. You got it.
All right, sure. Well, my name is Isaiah. By day, I am a personal trainer and a coach. I've been working in the fitness industry for about 15 years. I've been raised in the church my whole life, up until the age of 13 or so, when my mother gave me the choice if I wanted to continue going to church or if I wanted to choose to do what I wanted to do. And one of those decisions were made based off of the fact that my dad, my father wasn't going to church, and he had his issues growing up that I'm sure we'll go into in a future episode. But I kind of led by the example of him, where I was following the example of him, I'll say that, to just kind of basically just no longer go. I kind of grew up in a Pentecostal church, so it was more in line with charismatic kind of background. And at a very young age, I just was very intimidated by the things of God, and nothing was ever really explained to me. So naturally, without having just like a proper lens to view it by, and also not having an appropriate, father figure for me to see who God was, I quickly just kind of, removed myself from faith and kind of lived my young adult life without, any type of practice until I would say my late 20s, kind of the start of 2020 or so, during the pandemic. And from that point on, I've been kind of working my way back, through the faith, and just kind of learning and fumbling, and kind of existing as I try and do what I feel I'm being called to do.
Yeah. Good synopsis.
Yeah.
Yeah. Early on, born into a Christian family, Mennonite faith, and I was about 4 or 5 years old, um, and had a near death experience. Our family, nasty sickness, and I wound up fever, hallucinating, and it was near death. The doctor was there and said I can't do anything more for him. And my mom prayed over him basically and said, God, I give him to you. He's yours. If you take him, that's fine. But if if he stays, he's yours. And that started a chain, I think, in me, unseen at the time. Obviously, I was only 4 or 5 years old, but God just reaching out to me through many vehicles and people. When I was 13 years old, Christian camp, I surrendered to God, basically gave my life to Him and said, "Okay, it's yours." And then from that time on, several occurrences, you might call that were, um, I would say, supernatural in nature happened to me, and left me really with the notion that God was desperately seeking me, uh, and was going to use me for His purposes. And that was a at the time, I was probably 16, 17 years old, highly motivating, highly comforting, and yet still left with the feeling, wow, this is going to be a task that I really can't accomplish in my own skills and abilities. This is something that God's going to have to work out, and He really did. Through the early marriage, next steps of that, kids coming along when I was 22 years old, firstborn, and then my daughter was born about 3 years later. Um, and God put me in places where I really had to depend on Him, and really started to build my faith. Um, where I felt like it was God's work, it wasn't me, and led me into ministry. I was a youth pastor for 6 years, 5 years, um, and great times there. And then just a difficult stretch of divorce with my wife, and really searching for God. God was always there; He never left me. But I felt as though I was alone, and it really tested my faith. Um, and to where I am now, I can at least look back and see God's hand, God's moving, and God's using. And that's I would say, for me, it's been the strength uh, of my life. Is basically just understanding that God's going to be there, regardless of the situation.
Yeah, thank you. That's awesome.
Yeah.
As the episodes progress, we'll kind of dive into more topics
Oh
and,
my
kind
word,
of
yeah.
past memories. So just kind of keeping it, like a back cover. That way, we don't kind of lose people.
Yep. Yep.
We had a plan for this first episode, or the first couple episodes, to talk about invisible faith, and I think that is a very uh, important concept in today's day and age, because everything that we see now is very visible. With all the wars and conflicts and you name it. Um, there's so many things that are in front of us in a visible, tangible sense, and we wrestle with this idea of, is there a God? Or if you're following God, you're trying to kind of figure out, where does my faith kind of fit into it. Like, am I doing enough? All these different kind of questions that we ask ourselves. So one of the kind of topics that I kind of have here is this idea between, well, it's not between it, it's the idea that seeing isn't believing. I have this kind of like in notes: seeing isn't believing. So what I want to do is, I kind of want to go over a scripture, so when the audience kind of listens to this, they can kind of follow along, and we can just kind of dive in to the book of Exodus, which I kind of was kind of led to read this morning.
Okay.
um, so if you have your Bible there,
Got it.
we're gonna
Got
we're
it.
gonna turn to Exodus 14, and we're actually gonna kind of skip ahead, because we'll, in the general statement, for people that haven't read the Bible, or maybe they have and they've kind of picked pieces here and there. The story of Exodus is largely talking about Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt into the wilderness, and kind of their journey, their failures. There's a huge conflict that kind of unfolds, that I encourage people to kind of read through. But one of the things that I want to kind of talk about, is starts in chapter 14, verse 10, and I'll kind of read it. I don't know the version that I have, but you can kind of follow along pretty easily. It says, verse 10: When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone so that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." And Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you will have only to be silent." The Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they shall go in after them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, his chariots, and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. Then this is a little long. Then the angel of God who was going before the host of Israel moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. And there was the cloud and the darkness, and it lit up the night without one coming uh, near the other all night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night. It made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went in after them in the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And in the morning, watched the watched the Lord in the pillar of fire and of the cloud, looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels, so they drove heavily. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." We have a few more verses. Hang with me. Then the
Stay
Lord
with
said
me.
to yeah, and then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen. Of all the hosts of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, so that the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and his servant Moses. All right, so this was a lengthy excerpt, and you might need to read it yourself a few times. And one of the reasons why I chose this, it might seem like there's no like message in there for someone who's just reading for the first time, but this is like a large miracle,
Hmm.
right? So this is very
Hmm.
visual. It's not um subjective or something where it could be perceived as a miracle, but it could be coincidental. This is a very visual, supernatural miracle that occurred, where if they're painting and the author is painting an image of two giant walls of water separating, if you've seen movies depicting like Moses. So we have this highly supernatural visual occurrence that the Israelites saw, and they knew that they had witnessed a miracle and they were saved and they were rescued and they fled the scene. But one of the things that we see later on in the book of Exodus is that seeing not being enough, right?
That is
You know,
correct.
to kind of summarize the next couple of chapters, which we'll kind of go through, periodically. is they rebelled, they
Hmm. Hmm.
disobeyed, they fought against Moses. They erected, false idols. Basically different gods came before them, and they were doing all these different things, even though they saw the most miraculous thing imaginable, right? In
Yep.
modern day, you'd probably think of this being like, you're in rush hour and then God just kind of splits the cars in half and makes it so you can kind of drive. There's something very, very specifically miraculous about it, but it wasn't enough to change the hearts of the Israelites, right?
Hmm.
And so one of the kind of carryovers that I like to think about is, especially when people are new to faith and they're new to reading the Word, they always say, I would believe a little bit more in God if only I can see Him, right?
Hmm.
If only I can see Him working in my life. But there's so many different times in the Bible, hundreds and hundreds of times where occurrences like this happened, and people witnessed miracles and just supernatural occurrences, and it wasn't enough to truly change the outcome of their belief, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that is, it's kind of a paradox, but it's also just very fitting to our nature,
Hmm.
as humans, whether we're thinking of psychological aspects or spiritual aspects, we have a tendency to not believe our own eyes,
Right.
right?
Right.
Um, one of the things that I want to kind of transfer into is the idea of why our faith is invisible. It says in Hebrews 11, 1 through 5, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the
Yep.
conviction of things not seen. For by the people of old received their condemnation. By faith, we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible, right? And that's just a very kind of polarizing opposite idea that we see in the New Testament, which is the second half of the Bible,
Hmm.
where the author was basically communicating the fact that the faith that we're called to have, or we're called to practice or learn about, is more rewarding and more, you know intended to be invisible, right?
Hmm.
it, and that becomes very difficult for people to grasp, because again, we believe in this world we're seeing as believing.
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
but history tells us differently. Even history in the Bible, or history in more kind of other circles, where people will see things and they don't change the way they live, right? It's I see it very similar to in my job, where I will show people the evidence of something that they're doing wrong, and they see it, but then they don't change their actions, right? So
Hmm.
there's disbelief in the visual, where you really do have to just kind of practice that faith. Phil, I wanted you to kind of break out and just kind of add anything that you kind of felt about that scripture, or more so inclined to people who are listening that are coming from, again, different denominations, or maybe they just don't even know anything about God.
Yeah. Yeah. But there's a lot in what you talked about there, Isaiah, because I think if somebody to ask, what does faith in God look like, so I can see it. What does it look like? It is so hard. Um, and it goes past miraculous. You can't just say, well, uh, God did a miracle in my life, therefore I have faith in Him. Um, as a matter of fact, when you were reading that piece in Exodus earlier in Hebrews, there's a reason that God was so angry with the Israelites, uh, and it's because of their unbelief. They saw the very works of God firsthand, witnessed them, and they still chose not to believe, and they wound up wondering for 40 years. And in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 16, it says, "For who provoked him when they had heard? Indeed, did not all those who came out of Egypt, led by Moses? And with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not those who sinned whose bodies fell in the wilderness, and to whom did he swear that they would never should not enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient. And so I think there's a measure of faith that is tied to obedience, and it's exactly your example of your job, Isaiah. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Faith in Isaiah would mean, okay, Isaiah says, here's the plan for your life to get in better health, and I believe it. I'm going to do what you say. And I think God says that to us. You know what I mean? It's one thing to see a miracle. It's one thing to see action, but to be obedient to Him, even in those areas where we can't see what He's doing, is really, I think, the start of faith.
Mm. Yeah, no, I really love that. Yeah, one of the other things I have here kind of written is an example in the book of John. It's John chapter 20, verses 24 to 30. And, to the audience, the Bible is like this like hyperlinked book where you don't really read it like a novel in a sense. There's things that kind of connect to each other. It's almost like clicking a link on a website. It kind of takes you to a different page. So like the more you kind of read it, and the more you can kind of learn how to navigate. But we have like a lot of reappearing themes that occur both in the Old Testament, which is like the older books, and in the New Testament. But in John chapter 20, verses 24 to 30, it says, um, now Thomas, one of the 12 disciples, if you know the story of the gospel, there's 12 disciples, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. This was after he was crucified, right? He had rose from the dead. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side where he was pierced, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them, um, him being Jesus. Through the doors, though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put into my side. Stop doubting and believing." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." He's basically, seeing and believing. Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. But blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." So you see Jesus kind of echoing this story, this idea in the Old Testament of just so many of these miracles that have happened throughout all the books where, there's so much to be seen, and I see that a lot in the Old Testament. There's a lot of visual things, a lot of visual miracles that people rejected because of their defiance and their nature to just kind of rebel and to kind of do what they felt was necessary. And in the New Testament, you see like this kind of switch where it's okay, now we have to take the visible world and trust in the invisible. You know, I, I want to kind of dive into this topic over the next couple of episodes because this is like a really rich thing that we can flesh out. But what I want to do is answer a question that I actually had submitted to me earlier. And I think it's really good for us to do this because this will help with a lot of people that are watching. And it says, um, you know, and I'll kind of paraphrase, what denomination is the right denomination, or do I need to go to church, or this person who's a practicing Catholic, do I need to go to a mass, like basically asking like, you know uh, where do I go to spend time with God? That's kind of the crux of the conversation. And one of the things that I want to kind of communicate, at least with this show, and at least part of my beliefs, um, you know, a relationship with God is just that, it's a relationship, right? He doesn't want the religious, he wants the people to want to get to know him, right? Um, and the only thing that I would say is wherever two or more are gathered in his name, he's there, right? Even if you're in your own bedroom by yourself, he's there. Church is a great place to be. We're called to meet with one another. We're called to kind of support each other in a community sense. I'm not going to say that that's not in the Bible, but one of the things that I want to communicate with people that are just starting to kind of ask these questions and kind of learn about it is to just find whatever you can do to communicate with him, whether it's reading, whether it's saying a prayer, or just spending some time, in silence with him. Whether you have a friend who's trying to talk to you about God, maybe it's a Bible study. I have a very non-denominational view on faith where, I believe that, because I do believe in a heaven, I do believe in an afterlife. When we go to heaven, there's no denomination tables, right? There's no breakup between this person was a Lutheran or this person was a Catholic. It's just going to be who loved Jesus and who like wanted to be in a relationship with him and to obey the things that he asked us to do. And as far as I'm concerned, those are the very specific things that we were called to do to be in a relationship with him. We can kind of split hairs, but you know, with that kind of a question, when people, I have a lot of people that are in different, whether it's Orthodoxy or Catholicism or even atheism, and they're kind of asking these questions like, well, where do I have to go to do any of this? It's where you're at is perfectly fine. It's like a fitness journey. Like maybe you just start with some walks. Maybe you just start walking and trying to talk to him. Maybe you start to research some things where you're reading and you're questioning, right? Those are the very specific steps that anyone would do to start a habit, right? To start any type of a life change. And that is what it is to have like this invisible faith. It's a change of life, so that's at least in my perspective. So I'd like to kind of ask where you kind of stand on that, or if you just kind of like echo that. But
I would echo that. Yeah, I think it's a faith journey. That's a good title. I like that because it is a journey. I mean, we start obviously with faith as a child. That's how I started. Um, and sometimes you'd like to morph back there and see life in simpler terms. I think for me personally, one of the things that stands in the way of that is our own scars. That we've encountered through either disobedience or just life in an imperfect world. And sometimes it stops us short of having a faith that is pure. Um, so yeah, I think it's a journey. I think it's a journey. You just keep pressing towards, and sometimes you take two steps back and sit there for a while. And I can sympathize with that too. If people are struggling with that and really feel like they're floundering, you're not alone. You're not alone. I think God would say that He's right there with you. Um, and He's many times reached down and pulled me out of those situations.
yeah, and I think the biggest thing that is true with faith is the same with getting stronger or faster. It's intent driven, right? So that's the thing. It's um, whenever you're trying to change or make an adaptation in the body, a lot of the things that assist in that is your intention behind it, right? And I'll give you a simple example is, say I want to run faster. Well, I have to kind of think in my head that I'm trying to run faster. You're not just going to get faster by running slow, right? And so it's the same thing with faith, where I can sit in silence and not have the intention behind trying to be in silence with my creator, or you know the God that I'm trying to research and understand. Or I can be sitting in silence and being like, like, God, like, I really don't know what's going on. Like, can
Mhm.
you help? Can you give me wisdom? Can you give me clarity? Can you help me decipher all the noise and all the things that I see on social media or I read, or there's so much of a flood of information. But our God is a God of peace and is a God of wisdom. So I think that if you just allow yourself to have that intention behind those questions, and
Mhm.
whatever form that you start at is going to be good enough for you to see growth, to kind of see these things kind of develop over time.
Hmm. I have a question for you, Isaiah.
Yeah, of course.
We come from different generations.
Yeah.
What what do you see as more of a challenge to somebody that's closer to your generation compared to mine, like a baby boomer from, like born 1945 to 1960? Difference in grappling with faith then and now.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that the biggest thing that I see in my generations is trying to wrestle with how to fit the world in with faith, right? And that's, I think it's the same with every generation. But I do believe that when we looked at the baby boomers, or the Gen X, like there was almost like this consensus agreement that the world at large was kind of moving in this very conservative movement. So whether you were practicing faith or you weren't, there was just kind of like this path, right, that everyone kind of like followed. But in my opinion, the difficulty comes, especially with the younger people. They're trying to figure out how to mix and match the worlds, right? Where it's like, do I have to change my belief because of what's socially acceptable, or what's deemed correct, versus what I feel is being preached or kind of
Hmm.
written about. I would say that would be the largest one. The other thing that I see a lot of is um, there's too many information sources, and this is one of the things that I really wanted this show to kind of aid in, is having a more focused, message that isn't intending to divide or to cause any like questions. A lot of the podcasts that I will kind of listen to, they're very informative. They're talking about a lot of different things, but a lot of them are just kind of fear based, where you're learning about you know kind of these like esoteric concepts that can really be eyebrow raising, and kind of fearful if you don't really know how to base it, or if you don't have a hope, right?
Hmm.
A lot
Hmm.
of these things that you learn about can really kind of make you feel like you're kind of screwed, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it, and that is intentional in my opinion. There is like a divisive nature to information, but I find a lot of times with this generation, with the people I talk to, is they find faith through through the confusion, in a way, where it's like they're
Hmm.
they're looking for answers because they're seeing things just not line up. They're seeing whether it's some kind of algorithm that they're in, where there's just you know conspiratorial information, or just things that are just very kind of thought provoking, and it makes them really think that there's more to life than just the physical world. But they also don't have a guiding light to understand what they're supposed to do. They just see the corruption, and they see the lawlessness, or all these different things. And I find nowadays there's more of a need for um, information, right? Like we need to
Hmm.
be informed. One of the reasons why we first started talking was this nature of a lot of people that are in more of a traditional style of church may not be aware of certain things that are going on in the world. But then you're really, really stable in your faith, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And then we have this, opposite side of the coin, where I have a lot of youth that I talk to, and they're hyper aware of things that are going on in the world around them, whether it be political or just, spiritual, or what have you. And they have no like faith lens to kind of see things by.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
everything is just kind of doom and gloom, and everything is doom scrolling. That's what we call
Hmm.
it, when you're just kind of like scrolling and just kind of
I love
uh
that term. Love that
yeah.
term.
Yeah, and that's very kind of on brand. But um I think of, I'm paraphrasing, but I think of in the scriptures, I believe it was in the book of Revelations, and it talks about that we were supposed to be um kind of peaceable during times of trouble, right? I'm kind of
Yep.
paraphrasing it, but when the world kind of loses hope, like they're supposed to look to us
Yep.
to kind of see
Yep.
that we still have peace, we still have hope, we still have love, we still have these things that we were called to do, regardless of uh a timeline or what's going on in the world
Hmm.
around us. We don't waver from that,
Yeah.
so that's one of the things that I feel kind of led to talk about, because I don't see that being said. I don't see
Yeah.
that being, mostly because I don't think it's sexy. I
Hmm.
don't think
Hmm.
that people really want to hear that, because it kind of makes them have to pick a side. Like,
Yeah.
do I delve into this esoteric, fear mongering information source, or do I actually like get to know my creator?
Right. Right.
And I think you can kind of daywalk, you can kind of be between both worlds, but it takes someone who's been in it a long time to be able to do those things.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't think that we were intended to kind of be divided. And I think these two sources are kind of dividing us.
Hmm. Hmm. I like what you're saying. Um, First of all, I think, speaking from, this is a boomer, baby boomer, faith was handed to us much more in a packaged form, and we accepted it verbatim, sometimes minus experience, and that kind of led to like a secondhand faith. You've heard of that term before, where people are
Mm,
just, they said it, they're older than me, so therefore I must believe it about God. Where I think your generation, younger believers, are much more willing and able to grapple with God firsthand. And I think that I see some authentic faith coming out of that, where someone my age is, maybe the first uh, emotion that comes is fear. Like, wow, is God to be grappled with or wrestled with, or is he able to be talked to that way? And I think his answer would be yes. He loves us that much that he wants to hear when we doubt. He wants to hear when we struggle. Um, and I think my generation had difficulty even thinking about that, let alone talking to God and to others about that too. So I think I see that as a plus now, with people being more able to grapple with faith and with God. Um,
mm.
but you're right. I think there's definitely a vacuum of reliable information, biblical information out there. That's I think that's definitely suffered in the process.
Those are things that I want to dive into in the next couple of episodes. We'll kind of wrap it up, but the major feel and flavor of the show that I'm trying to develop is having these two lenses. Is that multiple lens? Um, where we have this viewpoint of the baby boomer generation, or any of the other preceding or current generations connected to that, and then you have the younger generations. There is such a divide in faith, or even just you know even in this, what we call like the secular world, or the world that doesn't have um you know an identity with a faith in Jesus or God. um they're even divided, right?
Mhm.
People that have no faith are divided amongst different generations. There's a complete divide. So those are things that I want to kind of unpack, because I think that both generations can learn from each other. There's a lot of things that I see the younger generation doesn't do very well when it comes to um, you know s- emulating the things that our forefathers have done. Being uh, you know more family minded, and just kind of more um, you know communal, if you will. I
Mhm.
feel like everyone's on kind of an island, and inversely, I feel that the older generations could probably learn a lot from the things that are kind of coming down the pike, if you want to say, these kind of harder to grasp concepts that people feel uncomfortable talking about, but they're a reality. And those are kind of the things that I want to flesh out as we kind of grow as a show, if you will.
Yeah, love that idea. Love that idea.
Yeah,
Yep.
cool. Awesome. All right, so we'll wrap it up, and we will get started on the next week's episode. where we can kind of keep on unpacking the concept of invisible faith, and we might even have some guests on to see if we can, continue to just be a resource of information.
Good idea. Good idea.